Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Stote. I'm the Media and Program Specialist here at the Framingham Library. I'd like to welcome everyone here in the room. What a nice crowd, and all of those watching from home. We're so thrilled you're able to join us tonight. And if you know anyone who couldn't make it tonight, the program will stay up on our YouTube channel and YouTube page, and you can watch it there. We're so excited to feature this evening Dr. David Smailes, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Program Coordinator and Advisor for the Political Administration Program at Framingham State University. Divide Nation, what Abraham Lincoln can teach us about our own political divisions. And tonight's lecture is a partnership between Framingham Public Library and Framingham State University. Just a few announcements before I turn it over. We'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones. And this lecture will be about 45 minutes, and then Dr. Smailes will take about 15 minutes of questions after that. If you could please hold them till the end, that would be great. We have some evaluation forms in the back. If you'd let us know what you think about these programs and any ideas you have for future programs. And just one more note for those who are watching at home. If you should lose our stream for any reason, just use your back button, go back to the home page, and you'll see a video there to click on. We'd like to thank our sponsors, the Joseph L. and Roy L. Freund Foundation, courtesy of Elizabeth F. Fideler. And thank you to the Friends of the Framingham Library. They really make these programs possible. If you'd like to donate to friends, there is a box available in the back. And just one more thing, the next lecture in the series is next Thursday, featuring Dr. Vinay Manam, who will be discussing, can the food industry be part of the solution to challenges in the food system? We hope you can join us. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Smailes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate it. I didn't expect this, but I actually got an added bonus tonight that I wasn't expecting. When I was a young lad in Ohio, I always had dreams of working for NASA, and this sort of headgear kind of a little boyhood fantasy here with the way I'm outfitted tonight. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope the topic will be an interesting one to you. I think that you know, as we face a lot of political divisions in our country, we're all really, I think, disturbed by the division that we have, and we're all looking for reasons or why and also solutions, right? Positive things that we can do, and that we can be a part of. And I think, as my title suggests, Abraham Lincoln has some ways to point us towards that. And so we're going to focus on Lincoln's thought tonight, but we're going to take what he has to say and bring it into our century and talk about our political issues around some of what he suggested. Now, fair question to ask, why Abraham Lincoln, right? I mean, if there's anybody who's been written about more than I think practically any other American president, it's Lincoln. You could fill whole wings of libraries with books about Lincoln, and certainly, you know, all those books have their own take on much of what Lincoln did as president and reinterpretations of Lincoln and so on. And I don't mean to suggest by choosing Lincoln that Lincoln was a flawless thinker, a lot of these questions. He had his faults, he had his limitations, some that were common to his time. Certainly his views on race and race equality are nowhere near what we would consider to be attitudes that should inform people around race. He had his limitations and blinders on some of those issues. And of course, he wasn't always the best judge of people either. He actually, you know, picked a lot of people to be generals of the Union Army that didn't work out so well, and he stuck with them maybe a little longer than he should have. So there are gaps in his judgment as well as anyone else's. But the reason I think Lincoln's important is because Lincoln was a very deep thinker. He was a deep thinker about his time. He was a deep thinker about the problems of his time, and he was very reflective about those problems and trying to figure out what to do about them. And throughout his life, he wrestled with those questions. A lot of people, as I suggested in my description of tonight, are talking about, you know, a second civil war in the United States. And I think a lot of that rhetoric, of course, is very exaggerated. We're not likely to ever see a day where there are two standing armies fighting one another in a second civil war. We certainly don't have regional differences the way that they did in the 1850s and 60s that led to the Civil War. It's a very different time. But John Meacham, who just actually published a very interesting biography of Lincoln, I recommend it to you, calls this a period of civil chaos rather than civil war. And I think that's probably a pretty good term for the time that we live in. We feel as though there's a lot of chaotic things happening in American society. And we also feel, I think, very generally that, as I say, there's an unpredictability about the future and what the future might hold. And so maybe it's more appropriate to think of it in terms of chaos rather than war. But certainly we're going through a period of time where our civil society is going through some very difficult times that on occasion have turned violent. And of course, that's something that none of us want to see. And I think in that, again, you know, Lincoln's thinking is perhaps the best guide for where we're going with this. Now, I'm going to tell you something that maybe is a bit of a surprise. If you are planning tonight to hear me talk about Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and during his presidency, we're not going to do that tonight. Lincoln, as president, faced these questions, of course, but he faced them at a time when much of what the Civil War had settled had already been done. And Lincoln, much of John Meacham's book, in fact, focuses on Lincoln's thought during the war and after the war. But I'm going to take you back a little earlier in Lincoln's life, because I think Lincoln, as a younger person, actually wrote more clearly about these issues in a very, what Meacham himself calls a very prescient way, of a forethought to the future of where things were likely to go. So we're going to go back to the very earliest period of time in Lincoln's development and talk about his ideas as a relatively young new politician. That picture is from the 1840s. We're actually going back about 8 years before that picture was taken, but that's the earliest photo we have of Abraham Lincoln. And I wanted to show it to you because I wanted you to realize just how young he was in the time that we're going to be talking about. Lincoln, the occasion for Lincoln's discussion of these issues was actually an invitation from an organization called the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. The Lyceum was an opportunity by invitation to come and address an audience on a particular political issue of the day. Lyceums were very popular in America in the 1800s. They've unfortunately, I think, faded. But we, in a sense, tonight are like a Lyceum, aren't we? We're here talking about important issues of the day. And much like you know, our presentation tonight, Lincoln's speech at the Young Men's Lyceum was his attempt to address a particular topic that he thought was an important one. So he was invited to speak at the Young Men's Lyceum. They did have one rule, though, that kind of limited what he could say. You weren't allowed to talk about politics, or at least political campaigning and political parties at these Lyceum speeches. The idea was to address bigger issues than the political issues of the day. And so much of what Lincoln had to say was couched in much more general terms than the particular give and take of politics that he was involved in at the time. Lincoln himself gave the speech in January of 1838. And at the time, Lincoln was 29 years old. He was just about to turn 30. So very early in his political career. He had just been elected a few years earlier to the State House. He was a representative in the Illinois legislature at the time that he was giving this speech. So he was kind of a natural choice, I think you might say, a contemporary of the people who were holding these lyceums, and a politician that they thought would be an interesting speaker to talk on these issues. And Lincoln had, I think it's worth mentioning, about a year before, published an article in the Springfield newspapers that actually did give a fairly strong condemnation of slavery, arguing that slavery, as I quote here, is founded on both injustice and bad policy. But I should also add that the one thing that Lincoln also said in that sentence was that he didn't think abolitionism was the right way to address the slavery question. So going into the speech, I think it's worth knowing that Lincoln's position on slavery was fairly well known to the people in his audience as well. And that's a bit important, as you'll see in a minute, on how we interpret his speech. So let's talk about the speech. The perpetuation of our political institutions was the title that Lincoln gave to the speech. And this is easily available if you want to Google it tonight and take a look at it. I recommend the whole speech to you. We're going to talk about the highlights of the speech. It's a very interesting one. But we're going to structure it in a way that I think maybe will take us through 4 different parts of the speech just to make sense of what Lincoln's talking about in each one. So we're going to talk about what I call the preamble, a kind of introduction to the topic that he gives. Then the problem that he foresees in the country at the time when he's giving this speech. and what he perceives as, in the third part, the true threat that is coming as a result of that problem, and then his solution, of course, in the fourth part of the speech. So we're going to walk through each part in this way to try to break down his argument a bit, and then, as I say, we'll apply it to our times today. So we'll start with the preamble. You know, one of the really interesting things about Lincoln that we don't often think about is that Lincoln's generation was really the first generation to fully be born after the American Revolution. Lincoln's generation saw itself as the inheritors of that revolution and the government that was created under that, as a result of that revolution. So one of the things that really characterizes a lot of people writing and thinking about politics during the 1830s and 1840s is a sense of obligation, that their job is to somehow carry on this inheritance that they've achieved, that they've received from the founders. And they very much saw themselves as protecting that inheritance. Lincoln describes it as a system of political institutions whose ends are the civil and religious liberty. The idea that these institutions that were created by the founding are the very sort of things that we need to preserve. And that his generation had themselves the advantage of being what he called the legal inheritors of this fundamental blessing, or these fundamental blessings. So the notion of inheriting something, and then in the third part of the preamble, passing it on to the next generation, right? This is something that we have to preserve and pass on to the next generation. It's a very old idea. If you go all the way back to Pericles in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, he gives a speech that Lincoln often sort of went back to with this notion of inheritance from those who founded the Athens in the case of Pericles, and the responsibility of passing it on. So these political institutions are a gift that have to be protected. And that's where the problem comes in. What's happening to those institutions during Lincoln's time? Lincoln says that the greatest danger is going to spring up not from abroad, not the danger of an attack from another country, but from within. It cannot come from abroad, he says. It's going to spring up amongst us. And very often, I'm sort of always attuned, when I read stuff in politics, very often that's the quote that is most often quoted from this speech. Maybe you've heard that quote before. The danger is not out from without, it's from within. It's often taken out of context, and it's often used in ways that I don't think Lincoln intended. In fact, it's often used by the very people he's the most worried about, as you'll see in a minute. But that's the idea. This is a problem that comes from within the country, not a danger from without. So what is that danger? The danger, he says, is the disregard for law. The danger is the wild and furious passions that drive some people in politics. The danger is the savage mobs that come about as a result of that passion. And Lincoln gave several examples in the speech that I won't go into for the sake of time in any depth, but he gave examples, for example, in Mississippi, of gamblers being caught gambling and by mobs taken and lynched, essentially. And then rumors of individuals, enslaved people who are planning insurrections, being grabbed by mobs and similarly killed. And then whites that are suspected of being supporters of those who are planning insurrections are also often being taken and killed as well. The notion that the mob is playing essentially judge and jury and executioner is the thing that bothered Lincoln the most about this. Mobs that have taken upon themselves to decide what's just and what isn't. And the consequence of that is several things, Lincoln says. First of all, the danger that innocent people are going to be killed. Mobs don't take time to really weigh the evidence. They simply act. And again, very often act with passion in wild ways rather than through reason. So there's always the danger that individuals who are innocent are going to be killed. There's also the danger that the action of these mobs will encourage other people to engage in this behavior that otherwise might not have done it. They may be lawless in spirit, but when they see the mob acting, they join in and they find safety and comfort in the fact that other people are thinking the way they do. So there's a danger, almost like a contagion, of these ideas, right, spreading to other people and encouraging this kind of lawless action. But that's not even the most important danger, Lincoln says. The most important danger comes from people who respect the law. Because when people who respect the law see people acting in this way, they have a tendency, he says, to lose faith in the law. That the institutions that enforce the law aren't acting in a way that are protecting the innocent, aren't acting in a way that are providing justice. Mobs have taken that over, and that creates the danger that many people who would otherwise be very lawful start to lose their faith in the idea of law, lose their faith in the role that government can play in enforcing those laws. So it is like a contagion in that sense as well, right? It not only spreads to the people who are most likely to take that on, people who are already lawless in spirit, but also it starts to work on the people who otherwise believe in law, but find themselves discouraged by what they see happening around them. So that's the problem. That's the problem that Lincoln thinks this sort of situation creates. But it also opens up the true danger that comes as a result, the true threat, as I call it. There will always be people, Lincoln says, who are ready to take advantage of this situation. And the way he describes them is very interesting. He says, men of sufficient talent and ambition will not be wanting, meaning will never lack them. They'll always be around. Men of sufficient talent and ambition will not be wanting to seize the opportunity, strike the blow, and overturn that fair fabric, meaning, again, these political institutions. There are always ambitious people out there who will use these opportunities to their own advantage, to take the opportunity to exercise power themselves because they have that ambition and they have that desire to do so. And to explain this a little bit further, Lincoln compares them to the founders, to the people who actually created the government, this government that he wants to protect through this inheritance. He says that generation also had its ambitious people. It also had its talented people. It also had people who wanted to make use of those talents and ambitions. But fortunately, he says, they lived in a time where that talent and ambition led them to create these institutions. They channeled that energy in a positive way. So when they had their ambition, as he puts it, they all sought celebrity, fame, and distinction and expected to find them in the success of their experiment. They knew that their success in creating this new government would be their legacy and would be the thing that would bring them fame. It's always an interesting kind of thing to look at language the way we use it and the way they used to use it. There's a wonderful piece called Fame and the Founding Fathers that Doug Adair wrote a number of years ago. Our notion of fame, of course, is that people recognize your face, right? People get to be famous for all kinds of reasons these days, many of them really terrible reasons at times, right? We're all familiar with people who we could admire, but we're also very familiar with people who are famous for doing terrible deeds. That's our notion of fame, our notion of celebrity as somebody who's well known in that way. Their notion of fame and celebrity, though, in the founding generation was more that history would remember them well. History would record their deeds. History would be the place where they would live on. So for them, fame and celebrity and distinction meant that they would live on in history and be remembered for the good deeds that they had done in this way. That was their notion of fame and celebrity. But Lincoln is suggesting there's a different kind of person waiting. That person, he says, cannot exercise their ambition and their energy in this positive way because the field of glory is already harvested. The founding is done. The building is finished. The country is created. The institutions of government go on. So those who would be ambitious and seek fame and the remembrance of history don't have the opportunity to do that anymore in the way that the founders did. But they're certainly not going to rest easily because Lincoln describes them, it's a very interesting simile he uses. He describes them as the family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle. And the examples he gives are people like Caesar and Napoleon, a little closer to his time. People who have this desire to rule, desire for power, they're never going to be satisfied with following the lead of others, a path, as he puts it at one point, that's already been taken. So will they be happy being representatives or senators or even presidents? Lincoln says no. None of those things will make them happy. None of them will really, quench their desire for this kind of fame. And instead, he says, they're more likely to turn to something else, Distinction will be his paramount object. He's talking now about one of these, tribe of the eagle. Distinction will be his paramount object, and although he would as willingly, perhaps so, acquire it by doing good as harm, yet that opportunity is being passed, and none left to be done in the way of building up, he would set boldly to the task of tearing down. If I have the ambition to be remembered, and I have the ambition to do great things, and I have no opportunity to exercise that ambition by building up, Lincoln's suggesting I'm much more likely to take that ambition and try to tear things down, make that my legacy. And that's the true threat, Lincoln thought. When all of this mob action is taking place, when respect for the law has begun to disappear, when people are losing faith, there's always a member of the tribe of the eagle who is waiting for the opportunity to lead those people, to lead them towards terrible results, simply because their ambition drives them to do it. Had they lived in a different age, they may have been very different people, but Lincoln sees them as the true threat. So, what do we do about this, right? It's a pretty dim, dark sort of view of politics, and again, in Lincoln's time, he saw this unfolding with some of this lawlessness that was going on. So what's his solution? Well, his solution is going to strike us maybe as a bit odd, but I think there's a way in which it grew in Lincoln's own mind that makes a little more sense. So let me, again, sort of take you through this real quickly. Lincoln was convinced that the best way to address this is to encourage a respect for the law, to discourage the idea of lawlessness. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution, kind of interesting to go back to the founders, right? The blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country. Now, that's a pretty bold statement, and already perhaps in your mind, certainly I know when I first read this, I was already a little disturbed by that idea, right? Obey all the laws. Well, some of the laws may not be so good laws. Some of them may be rather unjust. And Lincoln had a way of addressing that as well. He said, bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible. And while they continue in force, they should be religiously observed. If such bad laws arise, let proper legal provision be made for them, but until then, if not too intolerable, be borne with. So even a bad law, Lincoln's saying, should be obeyed. Even a bad law should be obeyed, even as we're trying to change it, even as we're trying to repeal it. As we're using the democratic process to make that change happen, we should still obey the law because of this respect, this need for respect of law. Now, that's, again, a little, at times I think a little hard to swallow, right? Because we, again, can imagine laws that we would not feel were laws that really could be followed with a good heart and a good conscience. And it's interesting, I put it a little in italics there because I think he leaves us a bit of a trap door, right? Obey these laws until then, if not too intolerable. And when I teach this speech in my classes, of my American political thought class, we always get into a discussion. What did he mean by that? What's a law that's too intolerable to be followed? Well, he doesn't answer that question, unfortunately. He doesn't give us any guidance in the speech as to exactly what he means by that. But I think there's a way we can kind of divine what he means, to figure out what he means. And to understand that, again, we have to remember his idea here is that this law will be changed, repealed, if we use the democratic process. But until then, we have to tolerate these laws. So the democratic process is really key, right, to addressing this problem of bad laws. We need to be able to use the democratic process to correct these bad laws should they arise. And I think the way to understand what he means by, if not too intolerable, is actually to turn to someone a little closer to our age, and that's Dr. King. Because Dr. King wrestled with this question as well. In his letter from Birmingham jail, he directly addressed this issue of bad laws. And the way it was posed to him is kind of interesting. Here he is leading protests, leading marches for the right to vote, for civil rights, and breaking laws as he's doing it in order to insist that a law be fairly applied, right, fairly followed. And he was asked, apparently, how can you figure that out? How can you talk about obeying a law and enforcing a law when you yourself are actually sometimes breaking laws in order to do that. And the way Dr. King put it together, and the way that I think is helpful in understanding Abraham Lincoln's point, is to say that there are really three different reasons or three different examples of what he considered to be unjust laws, or perhaps a better way of saying it, intolerable laws, to use Lincoln's language. First of all, he said, it's a law that fails to square with what he called the moral law or the law of God. I think that's the first argument we would expect that somebody of the clergy to make, right? Certainly. This idea of the moral law or the law of God should guide us. And as long as we share the religious beliefs of Dr. King and others who would make this argument, then certainly that's a very powerful argument to make. But we all know that not everyone agrees on what the moral law is, right? Or the law of God, for that matter. There are plenty of people out there doing things that I would consider, you would consider terrible things in the name of God or in the name of religion. So it's not much help to us. And certainly, I think Dr. King knew that too, because he doesn't just rely on that example. He gives us two more. He says, an unjust law is also a law where the majority inflicts on the minority, or that the majority inflicts on the minority, but not on themselves. They create a law that they make other people follow that they don't follow themselves. The idea of injustice or inequality under the law, that makes a law a bad law. And if you think about that for a minute, that actually fits pretty nicely with Lincoln's understanding of this as well. Because if we can make a law that says some people are allowed to vote and some people are not allowed to vote, then we've created a situation where that political solution doesn't work anymore, does it? The idea of going and repealing the bad laws and making changes through the political process doesn't make sense if you're denying people participation in that political process. They can't possibly use that process to address a bad law. And if that wasn't clear enough, he makes a third argument along the same lines. Laws that are inflicted on a minority which the minority had no part in enacting or creating because it did not have the unhampered right to vote. When you make laws that apply to people who have no say in them, that is also, Dr. King argued, an unjust law. And certainly that fits very nicely with Lincoln's notion, right? If we're going to expect the political process to fix these unfair laws or these unjust laws, these bad laws, as he called it, we can't expect that process to work well if we create laws that specifically exclude people from participation. So when Lincoln talks about intolerable laws, I think what he's referring to, at least in part, are laws that interfere with that very process that he thinks we should use to fix bad laws. The idea of using the political process and making it work for us. It's a very clever argument, I think, from Dr. King, by the way, just parenthetically, because if he can't get you with the first one, if you don't agree with his religion, if you're in any way a believer in democracy, you've got to agree with the other two, right? There's just simply no way around those two arguments for anybody who believes in or professes to believe in the American political system. For dictators, it's another story, but for people living in a democracy, those other two are going to get you if the first one doesn't. And certainly that was his strategy by presenting it that way, right? If I can't get you on the moral argument, I'll get you on the political argument. But one way or the other, you've got to agree with me. So to go back for just a second to Lincoln, certainly the idea of intolerable laws can be interpreted as laws that interfere with the very process of repealing bad laws and interfering with the solution that Lincoln has. So we've got that in our consideration, right? That we have to follow laws, we should follow law, we should respect law, but only if those laws don't interfere with the political process that allows us to address bad laws. That's certainly where Lincoln leaves us. But beyond that, Lincoln says this is something that should be taught from the very beginning of life. Let reverence for the laws be breathed into every American mother, to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. We should take these ideals and we should apply them and repeat them everywhere. They should surround our lives. If we're going to encourage this respect for law, we have to be sure that people hear it, understand it, and are really, in a sense, infused with it. He calls this the political religion of the country. Much like a religious belief, We should have a political belief in this ideal, this idea of respecting law. So again, for Lincoln at least, that was the solution to the problem. Now, as I say, I think part of the issue with all this is that Lincoln's own understanding of the institutions that he was defending grew in time. And the Civil War really, in a sense, brought that out. Because more than respect for law, what Lincoln started to talk about during the Civil War was a respect for the institution and ideals of the founding. It's not just law that we should be trying to encourage people to know and understand, but it's the ideals of America itself. When Lincoln begins the Gettysburg Address, right, he famously begins it 77 years ago, pointing us back to 1776. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's the centerpiece for Lincoln of American political life. That's what needs to be taught. That's what needs to be respected. We're fighting a war over that principle right now. And that's what, again, the Gettysburg Address tells us. And Lincoln, as president, of course, had an additional responsibility to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Another example of American law, in fact, the most fundamental American law that needs to be respected and protected. So Lincoln's, I think, own understanding of what he meant by preserving law and encouraging people to respect law comes through, I think, even more so later in his life when he talks about the preservation of the Declaration of Independence and its principles, as well as the Constitution. He always described, I think it's a good analogy to have in mind, that the Constitution is the frame of the picture, but the picture itself is the Declaration of Independence. It is central, he thought, to what America was about, the central belief of American life. And again, if we are to preserve law and we are to preserve those institutions of law, it means preserving those ideals of the Declaration of Independence. That's the new birth of freedom that he calls for in the Gettysburg Address. That's the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right, that Lincoln wants to preserve as well in the Gettysburg Address. So even the Gettysburg Address calls us back to this notion of preserving law and preserving political institutions based on these ideals. Now, what does that mean for us today? That's all Lincoln's time, right? And certainly the animating issue of the Civil War. But what's the threat today? How can we sort of reinterpret what Lincoln is talking about? Well, I think it's very clear in some ways. And certainly from the point of view of someone who teaches political science, it's a very disturbing thought to me. Only 47% of the American public, this according to the Annenberg Research Group that did this study last year, only 47% of Americans can identify the three branches of government. That's pretty disturbing when you think about it, right? Not only that, 25% couldn't name any of the branches of government, had no idea what that even meant as far as that goes. In American schools, only 9 states in the District of Columbia require 1 year of civics education throughout the entire period of time that students are being educated. 30 states only require a half year of education. 11 states require no education when it comes to civic education. And if that's not disturbing enough, boy, I'm really a downer tonight, aren't I? If that's not disturbing enough, take a look at this. When people are asked to name rights that are guaranteed in the First Amendment, 63%, well, at least it's over half, right? 63% name freedom of speech, but only 1 out of every 4 people could say freedom of religion is included in the First Amendment. Only 20%, 1 out of every 5 Americans knew that freedom in the press was protected by the First Amendment. 16% the right to assemble, and only 6% the right to petition the government. That's also, I think, pretty striking when you think about it. And if that's not enough, consider this: 25% couldn't name a single right guaranteed by the First Amendment. Now, are we preserving our political religion? Are we passing it on? That's the very disturbing thing, I think, about our time. The very fact that these ideals that Lincoln thought were so important to our civic life aren't being communicated, apparently, at least not in ways that we can measure in that sense. And that leads, I think, really to many of our problems that we talk about in politics today. And I'd be happy to discuss these. These are just the ones that I think are probably most prominent as a result of this fact that our civic education, our civic understanding has begun to disappear. Just the fact that we dispute over democracy and the functioning of democracy is evidence of that, I think. This idea of disputing what elections are about and how they're supposed to be run is pretty disturbing, but it's coming about in part because people don't have a fundamental knowledge of how these things work. Or consider this, misunderstandings about the power of the president and the role of Congress. How many Americans truly understand what kind of powers presidents should have and what they should not have if they don't really even understand the fundamentals of the Constitution around the three branches of government? How susceptible are they to other people telling them what those powers are when in fact it may not be true? Or this one, the idea of demonizing or dismissing political opponents, those who disagree with our politics. When we have no shared sense of democracy and how it's supposed to work, we start to see opposition as an evil thing rather than a legitimate part of debating issues and coming to agreements and concessions. We're losing that sense of that being the way that politics is supposed to operate. As well as the idea of disinformation. I mean, if anything makes disinformation possible, it's the fact that people don't have a working knowledge that allows them to say, I know that isn't true. I have doubts about whether or not that's truly a fact or not. And that's a disturbing thought as well, because a lot of that gets, of course, amplified by social media, right? Those ideas spread very quickly, and they spread to these people who don't really understand their own government, their own democracy, their own sense of how these institutions are supposed to work. And I'll just venture, there are plenty of people out there who are ready to take advantage of that fact. Plenty of people making money off of these things. Plenty of people encouraging these things because it means more clicks on their web page, or more people listening to their podcasts, or more people buying the products they recommend on those events. The tribe of the eagle hasn't disappeared. The tribe of the eagle has just been waiting for an opportunity, and this is one of them, to amplify those things in a way that benefits themselves, empowers themselves in that way. And I'll add one more that maybe wouldn't occur to us so quickly. These I think maybe would come to mind fairly quickly, but also I'd invite you to consider this. Consider what happened during the pandemic. You know, a lot of us just weren't really sure how to react to the pandemic. And many of us felt cut off, many of us felt alone, many of us felt like we were facing this challenge by ourselves. And one of the things I think that's come out, at least in my field as people write about these things, is the fact that our own sense of community, our own sense of connectedness to others has been harder and harder for people to perceive. We've lost what one study in the 1990s called, if you're familiar with a book called Bowling Alone, they write about this, what they call social capital. And what they mean by social capital, very simply, is our trust in others, our trust in our neighbors, our ability to turn to other people and solve problems together. That idea that somehow we're cut off from everyone else, that we're going it alone, that we're not really able to reach out to others and really, and in many ways, respond to crises, is a really disturbing thought because it makes all of us frightened. It makes all of us concerned about the future. It's like the contagion that Lincoln talked about of lawlessness, right? Even those of us of good hearts find ourselves sometimes discouraged and cut off in that way. So all of that is a problem when we lose that sense of civic society, when we lose that sense of connectedness through ideas that we share. And again, all Lincoln is pointing us to is the fact that we can address that by reawakening that sense, by encouraging that sense of connectedness. How do we do it? Well, we do it, I think, in a couple ways that we can manage today. One is to start to develop a common language and understanding of civic life. We don't talk about this enough. And I don't mean talking about it online. I don't mean talking about it through politicians. I mean talking to your neighbors about this. Talking to people that you know, people you encounter every day. The idea of talking about what we share as political ideas, what we share in institutions that we believe in, the connections that we have to one another. And again, when there are disagreements, and there are going to be disagreements, not dismissing those who disagree with us, not ignoring the disagreements, but addressing them, talking about them. And that takes me to the second one, encouraging those discussions any way we can. Providing opportunities as often as we can to talk about civic life, to talk about what these documents are, to explain to people who don't understand their own government how government is supposed to work, to be able to address what are really fundamental rights that we all have, that people may not be aware of or may not realize are guaranteed in the Constitution, to build that sense, again, of connectedness through those ideas, through those political institutions. And I think that leads us to this third, fostering this sense of community. I think when we have that sense of community, if you had friends you could count on during the pandemic, if you had people that you were connected to that helped out, then you know how important that was. You know how valuable this is, right? How powerful it can be. And there were people, I always enjoyed hearing these stories while all that was going on. I was feeling very much cut off myself from my students and from my classes, doing everything through Zoom. When I would read or hear these stories about communities getting together, people cooperating in ways that brought people together to try to address the pandemic, people looking out for one another, people checking up with one another. It's heartening to know that people did that almost spontaneously. But we should have ways of encouraging that, of trying to make that happen. It should be something that we turn to, rather than trying to buy all the toilet paper that's available at Walmart that day, right? The idea of hoarding is the exact opposite of this, isn't it? I'm looking out for myself and I don't care about anybody else. That kind of thinking is a prime example of, I think, what, again, Lincoln would consider to be a loss of our political connectedness. And then finally, in the end, through all that, again, this shared sense of our political religion. It's there. Don't let the word religion scare you. The notion is that we have shared beliefs. We have things that we have in common. We have things that we believe in defending. We may not all agree on what those are, but we should have those discussions. We should talk it through. We should not be shouting each other online. We shouldn't be dismissing people and ignoring people who don't agree with us. Maybe it has to happen person to person. Maybe it has to happen in small groups. Maybe it has to happen at community events like this one. But one way or the other, addressing those concerns, building that sense of trust, that connectedness, even accepting the idea that we're not all going to agree with one another on politics. That's the way you start to rebuild this trust in political institutions. That's how you begin to address the disagreements that we have in society. So does Lincoln have a perfect solution for us? No. What he has for us instead is a job to do, a way to address it, something that we should take away, I think, from his speech on the perpetuation of political institutions, and say, yeah, we are facing, as again, John Meacham suggested, a very similar kind of civic chaos. And the way to address that civic chaos is to begin to rebuild that notion of trust and that notion of connectedness. And I'm going to stop my sermon with that and open it up to questions, comments, thoughts, places where you agree, disagree. Feel free. I see your hand first, sir. That was more in the fifth. The question is, what was going on in 1848? I'm sorry, I have to remember to repeat the question so the folks online can hear us. No, it was a bit later. Actually, it was in the 1850s that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and sort of all that bleeding Kansas took place and so on. Oh, Dred Scott versus Sanford, that actually was 1857 or 1858, I think. Excuse me, I'm not sure which it is, but yeah, shortly before the Civil War began. In fact, Lincoln was convinced. He said that was the flame that lit the fuse as far as the Civil War was confused, the Dred Scott decision. But yeah, all that happened quite a bit after this period. I think in many ways, Lincoln wasn't really even sure that this was going to solve the slavery question, to address it in this way, but he thought it was a way at least of preserving the things that needed to be preserved while that debate went on. And I think maybe that's a difference that I think is maybe important to keep in mind as well. I saw a few other hands. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Let me just repeat some of that for the folks. Listen, I always sound like I'm a little thick by repeating. I don't mean to, but tell me if I have your point correct. That the way to begin to do this, the way to begin to rebuild this, is to do it with people who are immediately around you, people that you know, people that you can make that connection with. It's the best way to begin that process of rebuilding. I absolutely agree with you. I think in many ways we think of this as a very daunting task because the problem is so big, right? It's a societal problem. It's the problem of our age, right? It's the most difficult problem in some ways that we face because so much of everything else follows from having a healthy political life, right? A civic life. But to be able to begin to do that through that process of people individually making this happen is a way of trying to build that momentum that I think you're right. When the time comes for the more difficult questions, if we have that level of trust that's begun, we have a better way of addressing some of those differences that we're bound to have. We always will have. We won't all see politics the same. I'm not suggesting a kind of panacea here that we're all going to join hands and agree on everything politically, but we'll have an environment where we can talk about those differences safely because it won't call into question these civic arrangements, that the civic chaos that's been set off, I think, by much of it. Yeah, go right ahead. That's a good question. The question is, given Dr. King's standard and given Lincoln's concern about intolerable laws, if we use the measure of Dr. King's standard of unjust laws, does that mean that all laws were intolerable? I would say yes. And I think in many ways that was disturbing to some who believed that that, of course, was wrong, that situation was wrong. But it's taken a long time to address that, isn't it? Because it's not only an issue around race, it's also an issue around gender, isn't it? For many, many years, women were denied a political life. They were denied the right to vote and so on. And were living under the laws that were essentially imposed on them. So I think you could say much of our history did not measure up to what Dr. King would consider to be a just or unjust law. But I think in particular, the laws that he was addressing as part of the civil rights movement, of course, was the main thing that he was focused on. But I would agree with you. I think a lot of laws that we've had don't measure up in that way. Sure. Right. 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 So the question is, and again, tell me if I've got this right for the folks at home, but the question is this really something that's just unique to our age, or is it not something that is endemic maybe to America, or at least we've gone through these periods before? I'd have to agree with you. I mean, I think the Great Depression created a similar kind of danger, didn't it? In the sense that people thought society was breaking down. They thought the economy was failing. They were worried about their political institutions being able to address those problems. And it took a certain amount of work on Franklin Roosevelt's part to rebuild some of that trust in those political institutions in that way. Or the 1960s, where we had some pretty fundamental disagreements about the war, about society, about some of the ways that America was working its issues out. And it took a certain period of time for us to be able to rebuild that trust, didn't it? It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen easily. So I agree with you. I think we have gone through periods of time where we've had similar moments where it seemed as though our civic life was breaking down. I'll remind you just, this idea of civil capital or political capital, social capital, excuse me, this idea that, we're losing our ability to trust our neighbor. That book was written back in the 1990s. And they were already beginning to observe the fact that a lot of Americans weren't living in one place for very long. We were a much more mobile society. People weren't connecting with neighbors, therefore, in that way. Those of us who have been born and grown up and lived in the same place for 30 or 40 years developed that sense of community and that sense of trust. But many people who are more mobile never really developed that sense of connectedness to others. So we are in an age, I think, where this is becoming more difficult. But I think that you might say to add it on to that is this problem that we've begun to, in our political life, begun to reflect that and really in many ways haven't figured out a good way to address it. That's where I'm suggesting that idea of social capital breaking down is really something that we have to start to rebuild because we're seeing the consequences of it now, I think. The more that we have political disagreements and don't seem to be able to work them out is just more evidence, I think, that that's a problem that we haven't really solved yet. But I agree with you. It's not certainly unique to our time to have those kind of challenges. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Pretty frightening, aren't they? Right. You know, that's a very good question. The question is whether or not I have some geographic information about the places where this level of ignorance about institutions is higher. I have to be perfectly honest with you. When I was looking at that study, I chose not to look at that. I didn't want to know where those 11 states were that had no civic education. That was so disheartening to me in what I do. I thought to myself, I just can't look, because if my home state of Ohio is on that list, I'm just going to be heartbroken. Fortunately, I don't think it is. I had civic education myself in school. But the point is, a very interesting statistic that was along with that I didn't report, but I will, because your question is a really good one. Of those people who showed the most ignorance, in those numbers were places that had no civic education. Apparently, those two things were directly connected by this study. And the places that had the longest amount of civic education, those 9 states and the District of Columbia, had the lowest rates of ignorance on all of this. So it's clear that civic education works to address those problems. So I can't tell you the states, but I can tell you that let's hope not. I don't think it is. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, you know, I think it's a good point. You're feeling pessimistic about it. The fact that the political system, through things like gerrymandering, make it very difficult to change. I agree with you. I think those are all problems with the political system. But I think what's important is not to be discouraged by that, but rather to see it as a challenge, right? Because really what we're saying is we'd like to see something better. And you know, if there's one thing that I keep hearing from everybody at all ends of the political spectrum, because I like to keep my fingers in as many different sort of groups as possible out there, they all say the same thing. They mean something very different by it. They point to different places, but they all say the same thing. They're discouraged. They find it really frustrating. Why can't more people understand politics better and so on? It's something that we all feel, but the problem is we just haven't found a language to address it. We haven't found a way of talking about it that doesn't end with, do you think the 2020 election was stolen? Because those kind of litmus questions that immediately put you into a political box mean that some people are going to talk to you and some people aren't, right? That's what we have to get past. That's what we have to try to work on. That's where neighbor connecting with neighbor can be really important. Because if we don't just leave it at that and we don't allow the noise out there of people trying to encourage it for their own reasons, if we leave that out and can tune that out a bit with that personal connection, we can start to rebuild it. But it's going to take time. I don't mean, again, to suggest to you, as I think Lincoln was not trying to suggest, that this is a panacea that's just going to cure everything overnight. It's hard work. It has to happen from the beginning of life, as he suggested. It has to happen everywhere. We have to have these discussions going on. It's going to take time, but it is a path forward, right? It is a way of trying to address some of that frustration. And again, I think a lot of people feel it. I think a lot of people feel that level of frustration. Yes, go right ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Very good question. Can gerrymandering, is it settled or is it something that can be addressed when the other political party takes office? It happens every 10 years that we redraw these districts. That's why we have the census. We figure out where people have moved to, and then we have to sometimes redraw these districts. And it depends on who's in charge of the state legislature and the governor in most states as to which party is going to control that process. But yes, it can be addressed in that way. And certainly, it's been an ongoing battle between the two political parties. Everybody does this. It's not a partisan thing. And it's every 10 years. So, but I think one important, I just add this as an important element to that. Gerrymandering only works if we allow it to work. Ultimately, we're the voters, right? Just because they gerrymander a district so that's dominantly or majority Republican or majority Democrat doesn't mean the voters can't say, I'm going to vote the other way because I like the other candidate better, or I think they're addressing the issues better. So part of it's our responsibility, I think, as voters, not to give in to that kind of thinking, to be open to the idea that we don't necessarily want to be put in those boxes either. But it is a difficult problem, no question about it, and it is a very political problem in that way. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things, point you made about Lincoln was he felt that he had inherited this.
Yes.
Part of the first generation.
Right.
So my question is our country too old? And we are how many generations from that first? And who feels so directly what we inherited?
Right. Yeah. 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 So the question is, are we in a sense too old to remember those political institutions or that founding that Lincoln wants to point us to, and his generation felt so strongly as being the first generation outside? One of the things that strikes me all the time, and again, it's maybe my optimism about these things, but the books that tend to sell most often on nonfiction lists are books about the founding. They're books about people like Sam Adams and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. I don't know if you've noticed that, but they're very popular books. And people are always, I think, going back to that period and trying to figure out sort of the ideas that went into some of these institutions. And I don't think we've lost our taste for that. I don't think we've lost our sense of how unique this is. And certainly, again, to go back to this idea of ideas uniting us, I think a lot of people still take a certain amount of pride in what America was founded on and what its ideals are, and they just disagree about whether or not we're pursuing those in the right way. But I think that sense of uniqueness is maybe still there. And certainly that sense of wanting to know more about it is apparently still there. A lot of people are buying those books, and they wouldn't be buying them and paying that kind of money. Books are expensive these days, unless they were really interested in those topics. So yeah, I just like to think that's still alive somehow. Even though for Lincoln's generation, it was a direct, line from the back. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. That's a very good question. If we looked at the same survey 40 years ago, would it show the same thing? And if so, or if it was better back then, what's happened to education? Actually, the numbers are better in the past. They're even better 10 or 15 years ago, actually, it turns out, than they are now. Not by a lot, but by some, by a good 10, 15, 20% in some of those categories, which surprised me. But I think part of the reason for that is because we have really tried to stay away from these discussions because we know how divisive they are. The topics that we try to avoid anymore, right, rather than talk about. But I think, and I say this knowing that I'll probably get emails from colleagues and friends, it is a challenge, it is a call to our education system to begin to focus more on civic life, civic engagement, engagement with communities. I think it's an important thing that we've lost some track on. And, we've gone through periods of time. I think I was just born at this time, so pardon me with this, but I think of Sputnik, right? That call that, this ball was orbiting the Earth and beeping at us that scared us so much that we started to invest heavily in science education, and we started to emphasize the sciences in that way. And even today, in the last 20 or 30 years, STEM education is important. Now, I don't mean to dismiss that at all or say that was a mistake, but what I mean to say is I think we need a similar kind of energy behind the idea of civic life. And that's something that's maybe a challenge for people in my profession to bring about. It's certainly why I enjoy doing things like tonight, because it's my small way of trying to get those discussions going. It's part of the reason I teach what I teach with my students. Nothing makes me happier than to see my students posting things on Facebook 20 or 30 years out of college. I've been teaching that long. 20 or 30 years out of college, remembering things from my classes that they're talking about now in politics and political life, not because of my encouragement, but simply because they're still interested in it. That makes me feel like something's happening there, right? And that's something that really is encouraging to me. Maybe that is my source of optimism on all this. One last question, I know because we're almost out of time. Do you have something else you wanted to say? I thought, and I think, were you raising your hand earlier? I didn't mean to talk past your hand. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Well, go right ahead. Yeah, one last question. Yeah. 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 Right. 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 Yeah, good points. So let me again just repeat them for folks. One is the idea of even family members disagreeing on these things and how difficult that can be. And I agree. Some of those are the hardest conversations I think to start. Right, the most difficult ones to have. But your other point, the point about education and the fact that education and libraries seem to be under attack these days, and why would anyone really, in a sense, dedicate themselves to those institutions? I think in the same sort of way, maybe, and again, perhaps it's my optimism, but maybe in the same sort of way that people dedicate themselves to medicine, even though they know they're going to be a doctor in a remote place where they're not going to make a lot of money. Even people who dedicate themselves to public education, knowing that they're not going to be buying yachts in their lifetime with the money that they're going to make. Even people who dedicate themselves to volunteerism, right, and to community events. And even though they know that there's not a particular reward that comes from that, I do think we still have that sense of wanting to do those things. And maybe we're more concerned about those attacks because we realize that they strike at the heart of the places that can make some of this happen, right? So that's our call in a sense, right? As people who need to support those institutions, people who support, need to support the teachers, they need to support the libraries, they need to be able to say, this is important to me, and let me say why it's important to me. We can all start to do that, even though, again, there are other voices and sometimes very harsh voices on the other side. It's not something that should make us give up on it, I think. It's something that should challenge us, maybe, and at least make us say, there's a job to do here, that we have to start to encourage people to change in that way. I'm out of time, folks. Thank you so much for tonight. I appreciate all the comments.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Smailes, for your excellent and really timely presentation, and thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for your questions, and thank you everyone at home for joining us. Don't forget there are evaluation forms at the back. We'd appreciate it if you fill those out and check out our other programs. Thank you all for coming. Good night.